The thumping bass vibrated through the floorboards, a rhythmic tremor that felt entirely alien to Alex's carefully curated home. He stood frozen on his doorstep, the cool evening air doing little to calm the fire blazing in his chest. His usually quiet, tree-lined street was a flurry of activity, but it wasn't his neighborhood block party. No, this was something far more outlandish, something that made his mind reel, struggling to process the impossible scene unfolding before his very eyes. Fairy lights, strung with reckless abandon, twinkled around his front porch, framing his meticulously painted front door, which now stood wide open, inviting in a stream of unfamiliar faces. A huge white archway, adorned with fake roses and flowing tulle, had been erected on his front lawn, right beside his prize-winning hydrangeas. He blinked, hard, wondering if he was still dreaming, if the early morning alarm he'd snoozed earlier had somehow trapped him in a bizarre, waking nightmare. Inside, the nightmare deepened. The spacious living room, which Alex had spent weeks repainting to a soothing coastal blue, was now transformed into a makeshift reception hall. Tables draped in white linen were laden with food, mini quiches, colorful fruit platters, a cascading chocolate fountain that looked suspiciously like the one from the local rental shop. Guests, dressed in their finest, clinked glasses, laughed boisterously, and spilled champagne on his freshly polished hardwood floors. A DJ, hidden behind a large console in the corner where Alex's antique armchair usually sat, blasted pop music that echoed off the walls. And in the center of it all, under the elegant chandelier he'd painstakingly installed just last month, a young couple danced awkwardly, bathed in the soft glow of uplighting he definitely hadn't installed. It was a wedding. His house was hosting a wedding. A choked gasp escaped his lips, barely audible above the revelry. He took a hesitant step inside, the unfamiliar scent of expensive perfume and cheap champagne assaulting his senses. Then he saw her. Deborah, the HOA president, stood near the makeshift bar in his kitchen, her usually sharp features softened by a wide, self-satisfied smile. She wore a shimmering silver dress, her hair impeccably coiffed, a tiny, glittering tiara perched atop her head like a misplaced crown. She held a clipboard, of course, because Deborah always had a clipboard. She was directing a server who was refilling a punch bowl, her voice, usually a grating blend of authority and thinly veiled condescension, now sweet and melodic as she chatted with a guest. She looked like the proud mother of the bride, or perhaps, the chief wedding planner. Alex pushed through the throng of strangers, each step feeling heavier than the last, his mind racing. His initial shock was quickly replaced by a simmering rage, a feeling so potent it made his hands tremble. He approached Deborah, his voice a tight whisper, barely containing the fury bubbling within him. Deborah, he managed, the name feeling foreign and bitter on his tongue. She turned, her eyes widening for a fleeting moment as she recognized him, but the surprise quickly vanished, replaced by her usual placid smile. Alex. Oh, perfect timing. We need more ice in the champagne bucket, darling. Could you be a dear and check the garage fridge? Her tone was breezy, as if he were merely another hired hand, a convenient addition to her meticulously planned event. The audacity of it, the sheer, unadulterated gall, knocked the wind out of him. He stared at her, his jaw slack. My garage fridge, he finally choked out, disbelief warring with outrage. Deborah, what is going on here? Why is there a wedding, in my house? She chuckled, a light, dismissive sound. Oh, Alex, don't be silly. It's for Felicity and Kevin. Such a lovely couple, aren't they? And this house, well, it's just perfect for an intimate garden reception. We've been planning it for weeks. She gestured around his living room as if it were a public venue, available for booking. Don't worry, we'll clean up. Just a few more hours, then we'll be out of your hair. She then turned back to the server, already dismissing him. He couldn't breathe. His home, his sanctuary, had been invaded, appropriated, and used for an event he knew nothing about, all under the pretense of it being a grand gesture from the HOA. It was a violation of every boundary imaginable, a slap in the face to his trust, and a complete disregard for his rights as a homeowner. His eyes swept across the room again, taking in the smiling faces, the dancing couple, the spilled drinks. He saw a child, no older than 7, drawing with crayon on his living room wall, a permanent marker clutched in his tiny hand. A permanent marker. A cold, clear resolve settled over him, pushing out the initial shock and rage. He pulled out his phone, his fingers moving with surprising steadiness, and dialed a number. The music still blared, the laughter still echoed, but in his mind, everything went silent. He raised the phone to his ear, his gaze fixed on Deborah, who was now laughing heartily at a joke made by one of the wedding guests. "Yes, this is Alex, at 123 Maple Street," he said into the phone, his voice now devoid of emotion, eerily calm. "I need to confirm the demolition schedule for my property." "Yes, the one we discussed last month. Please ensure it's moved up to, first thing tomorrow morning." "No, everything inside is being removed. Complete teardown." "No, really, everything." He paused, letting his words sink in, a chilling finality to his tone. Deborah's laughter faltered. Her head snapped towards him, her eyes wide with sudden, dawning horror. The music seemed to mute, the background chatter fading into an indistinct hum as her expression shifted from smug satisfaction to utter disbelief. "Yes, tomorrow morning," Alex repeated, his voice carrying over the sudden, uneasy quiet. "The sooner, the better. How did it come to this? How could a simple desire for a peaceful life in a charming suburban neighborhood lead to such an extreme, irreversible decision?" The answer lay buried in the long, winding road of small injustices, petty rules, and the slow, insidious creep of a person's absolute certainty that they knew best, that their will was law. Alex had purchased his house on Maple Street 8 months prior, drawn to its cozy, craftsman-style charm and the promise of quiet, community-focused living. After years of city life, the idea of a detached home with a small garden, where the loudest noise was the chirping of birds, felt like a dream. He was a kind-hearted person, a true believer in the power of empathy, always willing to lend a hand, to see the best in people. He envisioned potlucks, friendly waves over fences, and children playing safely in the streets. He wanted to be a good neighbor, to contribute positively to the fabric of his new community. The house, a charming 2-story with a welcoming front porch, was everything he'd hoped for. It needed a little work, some fresh paint, a few leaky faucets fixed, but Alex was handy and enjoyed the process of making a house truly his own. He loved the scent of sawdust, the satisfying thud of a hammer, the way a room transformed under a fresh coat of paint. He'd spent weekends meticulously tending to his small patch of lawn, planting vibrant petunias and fragrant lavender in the flower beds, imagining them bursting into color in the spring. He truly cared for his home, nurturing it like a beloved companion. His first introduction to the Maple Street Homeowners Association, or the Maplewood Estates HOA, as it was officially known, came in the form of a thick welcome packet left on his doorstep. It was filled with rules and regulations, a comprehensive guide to maintaining the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. Alex skimmed through it, noting the usual directives: keep lawns mowed, don't paint your house neon green, no RVs parked in driveways for extended periods. It seemed reasonable enough, designed to protect property values and ensure a pleasant living environment for everyone. He wasn't looking for conflict, he was looking for peace. Then he met Deborah. She arrived on his doorstep a week after he moved in, a plate of what she proudly called her famous lemon bars in one hand and, predictably, a pristine white clipboard in the other. She introduced herself as Deborah Harding, the current HOA president, and extended a perfectly manicured hand. Her smile was wide, almost too wide, revealing a set of unervingly straight, bright white teeth. She wore a tailored blazer over a pastel blouse, even though it was a warm Saturday afternoon, giving her an air of perpetual preparedness. "Welcome to Maplewood Estates, Alex," she had chirped, her voice just a decibel too loud for a casual conversation. "We're so delighted to have you. I just wanted to personally drop off these delectable treats and go over a few of our community guidelines. Just a little welcome chat, so you feel right at home." Alex, ever the polite and empathetic soul, accepted the lemon bars with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Deborah, that's so kind of you. They look delicious." He invited her in, offering her a glass of iced tea. He truly wanted to connect with his neighbors. Deborah, however, declined to step inside, preferring to stand on his porch, her gaze sweeping over his newly painted trim, his freshly mulched flower beds. Her eyes lingered for a moment too long on a small gnome he'd placed whimsically by his mailbox, a gift from his niece. Alex noticed her lips thin almost imperceptibly. "Oh, you've done wonders with the place already," she exclaimed, though her tone lacked genuine warmth, sounding more like a prescripted compliment. "Just a quick note, Alex, about the exterior paint. We do have a very strict palette for exterior colors. It's for uniformity, you see. Your current shade of coastal blue is quite lovely, truly, but it's not on our approved list. I've enclosed the approved swatches in your welcome packet. You'll have a 90-day grace period to repaint." Alex blinked. He had meticulously chosen that blue, picking it from a reputable paint store's approved for historical homes collection, believing it would blend beautifully with the neighborhood's charm. "Oh, really? I thought it was quite traditional." "I checked the guidelines, but I didn't see a specific list of colors, just a general note about harmonious tones." Deborah tapped her clipboard with a perfectly manicured nail. "Ah, yes, the updated addendum, dear. It was mailed out last month. Perhaps you missed it during your move. No worries, though. 90 days is plenty of time. And speaking of which," her eyes darted to the gnome, "decorative lawn ornaments are restricted to holiday seasons only. Your gnome, while charming, would need to be put away until, say, Christmas. Unless it's a themed holiday gnome, of course, then we can discuss a temporary waiver." Alex felt a tiny prickle of annoyance, but he suppressed it. Kindness, empathy, he reminded himself. She was just doing her job, trying to maintain order. "Understood, Deborah. I'll look into the paint and move the gnome. Thanks for the heads up." This initial encounter, seemingly benign, was a precursor to a steady stream of what Alex soon came to call Deborah's daily directives. It began innocently enough. A neatly typed note left in his mailbox about a single fallen leaf on his driveway. "Maplewood Estates prides itself on impeccable curb appeal, dear neighbor." A passive-aggressive email about his trash cans being left out for an extra hour past pickup time, a gentle reminder. Receptacles should be stored out of sight by 6 p.m. on collection days. Each message, while polite in its phrasing, carried an underlying current of judgment and a subtle threat of fines. Alex tried to be understanding. He repainted his house a slightly more muted shade of gray-blue from the approved palette, even though his heart wasn't entirely in it. He dutifully stored his gnome away in the garage, feeling a pang of sadness as he tucked away the whimsical gift. He was careful with his trash cans, setting a reminder on his phone. He genuinely wanted to get along, to be part of the community. He believed that most people, given a chance, were reasonable, and that a little understanding could go a long way. He often helped his elderly neighbor, Martha, with her groceries, and offered to mow her lawn when he did his own. He exchanged pleasantries with Sarah and David, the young couple 2 doors down, and often shared tips on gardening. He was a model neighbor, living by the principles of mutual respect and helpfulness. But Deborah's directives grew increasingly intrusive. She once questioned the type of flowers he was planting, suggesting that hydrangeas, while beautiful, attracted too many bees and might pose a nuisance to neighbors with allergies. Alex, who loved gardening, patiently explained that hydrangeas were not known for aggressive bee attraction, but Deborah merely sniffed and said, "Well, just a thought, dear." One sweltering July afternoon, Alex decided to set up a small inflatable pool in his backyard for a few hours. It was a scorching day, and he just wanted to cool off. The pool was tiny, barely big enough for one person to lounge in, and was completely out of sight from the street, hidden by his privacy fence. He was enjoying a book by the water when Deborah's voice, startlingly close, boomed over his fence. "Alex. Is that an unauthorized water feature?" She called out, her voice sharp with a hint of accusation. Alex nearly jumped out of his skin. He stood up, shielding his eyes from the sun. "Deborah? I didn't know you were home." "I'm always home when I need to be, dear," she replied, her face appearing over the fence, her expression stern. She must have been standing on something to see over his 6-foot privacy fence. The HOA rules are very clear about temporary recreational structures. Any pool exceeding 2 feet in depth, or remaining in place for more than 48 hours, requires prior approval and a safety inspection. "Is that pool deeper than 2 feet?" Alex sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "It's about a foot deep, Deborah, and it's just for this afternoon. I'll deflate it before dinner." "Well," she huffed, "I'll make a note of it. Just be mindful of the rules, Alex. They're for everyone's safety and the harmonious aesthetic of the neighborhood." She then disappeared from view, leaving Alex staring at his harmless little pool, feeling like he was under constant surveillance. His empathy was being tested, severely. He knew she meant well, perhaps, in her own twisted way, but her actions were becoming oppressive. The most extreme instance before the wedding invasion came just last week. Alex had planned a small, intimate backyard barbecue for his birthday. He'd invited Martha, Sarah, and David, and a few close friends from out of town. He specifically chose low-key music, kept the volume down, and planned for everyone to leave by 10 p.m. He even put a polite note in his neighbors' mailboxes, apologizing in advance for any minor noise and providing his phone number in case of issues. He truly wanted to be considerate. The barbecue was going wonderfully. The grill was sizzling, laughter filled the air, and a relaxed, friendly atmosphere enveloped his backyard. Alex felt a rare moment of genuine peace and happiness. Then, at precisely 8:30 p.m., the doorbell rang persistently. Alex opened the door to find Deborah standing there, arms crossed, her clipboard clutched tightly to her chest like a shield. Her face was set in a grim expression, her lips a tight line. She wasn't smiling. "Alex," she began, her voice cold and formal, utterly devoid of the overly sweet affectation she usually employed. "I'm afraid I have to issue a formal complaint. Noise ordinance violation. And unauthorized gathering." Alex's eyebrows shot up. "Noise ordinance? It's 8:30 p.m., Deborah. And unauthorized gathering? It's my birthday barbecue. In my own backyard." "Indeed," she replied, her eyes narrowing. "Our bylaws state that any gathering of more than 6 individuals requires a community permit, filed no less than 2 weeks in advance. And as for noise, while your music isn't overtly loud, the collective chatter and laughter of this many people can be quite disruptive to the tranquility of Maplewood Estates." She gestured vaguely towards his backyard, where his 5 friends and 3 neighbors were enjoying themselves. "Deborah, this is ridiculous," Alex said, his patience finally fraying. "There are 9 of us. We're not causing a ruckus. This is my private property." "Private property still falls under HOA jurisdiction, Alex," she corrected, her voice dripping with self-importance. "And the guest count is irrelevant, the rule is clear. You have violated Article 7, subsection C, large gatherings and community disturbance. Effective immediately, your gathering must cease. And you will be assessed a fine of $200. Alex stared at her, utterly dumbfounded. A $200 fine for a quiet backyard birthday party with a handful of friends? His initial belief in her good intentions had long since evaporated, replaced by a growing conviction that Deborah was not just a stickler for rules, but a control freak, someone who reveled in wielding petty power. This was no longer about kindness or empathy, it was about outright hostility. He stood there, watching her, feeling a knot of pure frustration tighten in his stomach. He didn't know it then, but this seemingly minor act of overreach would be the final straw, the spark that would ignite a chain of events leading to a truly shocking retaliation. The humiliation and anger he felt at that moment, standing on his porch as his birthday party was effectively shut down by the HOA president, would fester, growing into a resolve so firm, so unyielding, that it would ultimately lead him to the most drastic decision he could possibly make regarding his house. He closed the door, turning back to his stunned guests, the sound of his heart hammering in his chest, a low, dangerous hum. The wedding was yet to come, but the seeds of destruction had already been sown. The morning after the birthday party debacle, Alex felt a suffocating weight pressed down on him. The cheerful atmosphere of the previous evening had been utterly crushed, replaced by a lingering sense of indignation. His friends had left early, uncomfortable with Deborah's sudden, authoritarian intrusion. Sarah and David had offered sympathetic glances, and Martha had squeezed his arm reassuringly, but the damage was done. Alex had spent the rest of the night pacing his living room, the quiet hum of his refrigerator seeming to mock the silence where laughter should have been. He picked up the $200 fine notice Deborah had tucked under his doormat, an official-looking document with the HOA logo at the top and Deborah's imperious signature at the bottom. It wasn't just the money, it was the principle. It was the feeling of his personal space being violated, his autonomy stripped away by someone who clearly believed she had ultimate authority over every blade of grass and every breath taken in Maplewood Estates. He tried to shake off the anger. Kindness and empathy, he reminded himself, a mantra that felt increasingly difficult to uphold in the face of Deborah's relentless micromanagement. He considered his options. He could pay the fine and just try to avoid Deborah, but that felt like admitting defeat. He could contest it, but the HOA bylaws, as he was quickly learning, seemed to be interpreted solely by Deborah herself, often with an almost gleeful disregard for common sense or proportionality. He spent the morning working in his garden, pulling weeds with a little too much force, trying to channel his frustration into something productive. The sun was warm, the birds were singing, and for a few hours, surrounded by the vibrant petunias he'd planted, he almost forgot about the looming presence of the HOA president. Later that afternoon, a gentle knock came at his front door. It was Martha, his elderly neighbor. She held a small, neatly wrapped plate. "Alex, dear," she said, her voice soft and apologetic. "I just wanted to bring you some of my oatmeal cookies. Anne. I'm so terribly sorry about last night. Deborah can be a bit much, bless her heart." Martha's eyes, usually twinkling with good humor, held a genuine sadness. She lived alone, her children grown and living far away, and Alex often checked in on her, helping with odd jobs around her house. They had developed a quiet, comfortable friendship. "Thanks, Martha," Alex said, accepting the cookies with a grateful smile. "It's really all right. Just a little frustrating." He chose his words carefully, not wanting to burden her with his troubles. Martha, however, wasn't easily fooled. "No, it's not all right, Alex. She's gone too far this time. A birthday party? Really? I heard her. Standing on my porch like a sentry. This isn't the Maplewood I moved into, not with Deborah running the show." She sighed, a deep, weary sound. "She's been getting worse, you know. Ever since she became president. It used to be just polite reminders about lawns or paint, but now it's personal." Alex invited Martha in for a cup of tea, and they sat in his sun-drenched kitchen, the aroma of oatmeal cookies filling the air. Martha recounted stories of Deborah's escalating strictness. How she'd issued a fine to the Millers for having a slightly overgrown rose bush that, in Deborah's opinion, obscured the clear sight line of the street number. How she'd sent a stern letter to old Mr. Henderson, a retired veteran, because his American flag, while perfectly displayed, was deemed to be too faded and needed replacing immediately. Each story chipped away further at Alex's remaining empathy for Deborah, revealing a pattern of behavior that was less about community well-being and more about control and self-importance. She even tried to tell me I couldn't put out my bird feeder, Martha whispered, as if revealing a dark secret. Said it attracted squirrels, and squirrels could damage roof shingles. Squirrels. Can you imagine? I told her my birds bring me joy, and if a squirrel gnaws on a shingle, well, that's my problem, not hers. She eventually backed off on that one, but she made a note in her little book. Martha tapped her temple conspiratorially. She has a book, you know. Of all the infractions. All of them. Alex listened, a cold dread creeping into his stomach. The pattern was clear. Deborah saw herself not as a community facilitator but as an overlord. And his house, his sanctuary, was now firmly in her crosshairs. He thanked Martha for the cookies and her stories, feeling a surge of protectiveness for his kind neighbor. He promised himself he wouldn't let Deborah run roughshod over Martha, or anyone else, if he could help it. He would fight this. Not just for himself, but for the quiet peace of the neighborhood he had fallen in love with. The next few days were quiet, but the quiet felt like the calm before a storm. Alex diligently paid the fine for the unauthorized gathering, choosing to fight bigger battles down the road. He sent a polite, but firm, email to the HOA board, formally contesting the fine and citing his privacy rights, the lack of actual disturbance, and the precedent of other larger gatherings that had gone unpunished. He knew it was a long shot, but he wanted a record. He wanted his voice heard. He continued his routine, watering his lawn, tending his flowers, exchanging friendly greetings with Sarah and David when they walked their dog. He even saw Deborah once, across the street, scrutinizing a newly planted tree in another neighbor's yard with her ever-present clipboard. She didn't meet his eye. This small victory, a temporary retreat from her constant scrutiny, gave him a sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, his firm stance had given her pause. Maybe she would finally realize that her excessive rules were doing more harm than good. That hope, however, was short-lived. A week later, Alex received a certified letter from the HOA. The envelope felt thick, heavy with the weight of officialdom. His heart sank as he tore it open. It wasn't a response to his appeal. It was worse. Much, much worse. The letter stated, in cold, legalistic language, that due to repeated violations of community bylaws, a pattern of non-compliance, and failure to uphold the aesthetic and peaceful standards of Maplewood Estates, his property at 123 Maple Street was being designated as a problem residence. This designation, the letter explained, came with a new set of heightened rules and restrictions. He skimmed through the points, his eyes widening with each line. He was now required to submit a detailed plan for all exterior landscaping changes, no matter how minor, for board approval. He was prohibited from hosting any outdoor gatherings of more than 3 people without prior written consent, regardless of time or noise level. He was mandated to have his lawn professionally mowed and edged twice a week, even though he meticulously cared for it himself. And then, the kicker. A new clause, seemingly pulled out of thin air, stated that due to his history of non-compliance with community gathering regulations, the HOA reserved the right to utilize common areas or, in extenuating circumstances, underutilized private property, for approved community events, to foster greater neighborhood cohesion and adherence to established guidelines. Alex reread that last sentence, his blood running cold. Underutilized private property. He didn't have a massive backyard. He used every inch of it. The implication was clear: Deborah, through the HOA, was giving herself permission to commandeer his space. This wasn't about community cohesion, it was about power, punishment, and control. It was a thinly veiled threat, a declaration of war. He knew, deep in his gut, that this was Deborah's direct response to his challenging the fine, her way of showing him who was truly in charge. His hands began to tremble, not with anger this time, but with a growing sense of helplessness and a profound feeling of being trapped. What could he do against such relentless, legally sanctioned harassment? His empathy for her was completely gone now. This was not a person making mistakes, this was a person actively inflicting harm. He called his real estate agent, Robert, who had helped him buy the house. Robert listened patiently, his voice filled with sympathy. "Alex, I'm so sorry you're going through this. Deborah Harding, she's known for being a bit intense. But this problem residence thing, and the clause about using private property? That's really pushing the boundaries. It sounds highly questionable legally. HOAs have a lot of power, but even they have limits." Robert advised him to seek legal counsel, recommending a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. "It'll be expensive, Alex, but it sounds like you need to protect yourself." The thought of a legal battle filled Alex with dread. He was a peaceful person, not a litigator. But the alternative, living under Deborah's tyrannical thumb, constantly fearing the next absurd rule or fine, was unbearable. He couldn't live in a house where he felt like a prisoner, where every personal choice was subject to external approval. He considered selling, but the thought of leaving his beautiful home, the one he had poured so much love and effort into, broke his heart. This wasn't just a house, it was the embodiment of his dream for a quiet, fulfilling life. Over the next few weeks, the tension in the neighborhood became palpable. Alex wasn't the only one feeling the squeeze. Martha received another notice about her bird feeder, this time with a threat of a direct fine if it wasn't removed within 72 hours. Sarah and David were cited for leaving their recycling bin out overnight, even though they'd forgotten it only once. Deborah's power seemed to swell with each new infraction, her confidence growing bolder. She walked around the neighborhood with an even more self-important air, her clipboard now a symbol of her iron grip. Alex made an appointment with the lawyer, a stern-faced woman named Ms. Reynolds. She reviewed his documents, shaking her head frequently. "This is aggressive, Mr. Thompson. While the HOA has broad powers, this underutilized private property clause is highly suspect. It skirts the line of fundamental property rights. We can certainly fight this, but it will be a protracted battle." She outlined the costs, the potential for long, drawn-out proceedings, and the uncertainty of the outcome. It was a daunting prospect. Returning home from the lawyer's office, Alex felt utterly drained. The legal route, while viable, felt like a drain on his spirit and his finances. He just wanted his life back. He sat on his front porch, watching the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over his perfectly manicured lawn. He loved this house. He loved this street, despite Deborah. He loved the sense of belonging he had, however fragile, with Martha, Sarah, and David. He closed his eyes, trying to imagine a life free from Deborah's suffocating control. Then, a few days later, a flyer appeared in his mailbox. It was a bright, glossy advertisement from the HOA, announcing a community spring gala and fundraiser. The date was less than a month away. The venue was listed as the Maplewood Estates Community Pavilion and selected private properties. And under a small, discreet asterisk, barely noticeable, was a tiny line of text: "Special thanks to Mr. Alex Thompson for graciously offering his beautiful residence for the intimate garden reception portion of the evening." Alex's breath hitched. His name. His house. He hadn't offered anything. He hadn't been asked. He certainly hadn't given permission. Deborah had just unilaterally decided. She hadn't even bothered to inform him directly. She had simply announced it to the entire community, presenting it as his generous contribution. The brazenness of it, the absolute disregard for his ownership, privacy, and personal will, was astounding. It wasn't just a violation, it was an act of complete domination. His blood ran hot, a dangerous fury building within him, eclipsing all previous frustrations. This was no longer a battle, it was war. He felt his anger sharpen into something cold, something determined, something utterly ruthless. There would be no more empathy. There would be no more second chances. He stood there, the glossy flyer crumpled in his hand, a chilling silence descending around him, as a truly radical plan began to form in his mind. The crumpled flyer lay discarded on Alex's kitchen counter, a bright, taunting smear of glossy paper amidst the mundane reality of his coffee maker and fruit bowl. His initial shock had given way to a chilling clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a hostile takeover. Deborah wasn't merely overzealous, she was fundamentally disrespectful of other people's property and their very right to exist peacefully within their own homes. The thought of a wedding, a joyful, intimate event, being forcibly imposed upon his sanctuary, made his stomach clench. The audacity was beyond belief. He spent the next few days in a strange state of calm, a quiet hum of dangerous determination replacing the frantic anger he'd felt before. He continued his daily routines, tending to his garden, walking by Martha's house and exchanging gentle waves. He even managed a polite nod to Sarah and David as they walked their energetic retriever. On the surface, everything seemed normal, but beneath it, Alex's mind was a whirlwind of calculations and defiant plans. The idea that had sparked in his mind after reading the flyer had taken root, growing steadily more concrete and, in its own way, terrifyingly logical. He pulled out the HOA bylaws once more, poring over every clause, every subsection, searching not for loopholes to avoid fines, but for something far more drastic. He needed to understand the limits of their power, and more importantly, the limits of his own. He specifically focused on clauses related to property modifications, demolition, and the process of disengaging from the HOA, even if only in his own mind. The language was dense, filled with legalese, but he persevered, highlighting key phrases, sketching out timelines. His research led him down a rabbit hole of property law and construction regulations. He learned about permits, notices, and the various stages of property development and, conversely, property dissolution. The process of demolition, he discovered, was surprisingly straightforward, assuming one owned the property outright and secured the necessary permits. It involved notifying the city, hiring a licensed contractor, and ensuring all utilities were disconnected. It was a drastic, final step, but it was his step. He owned the land. He owned the house. And if the house was no longer his to control, if it could be unilaterally hijacked for community events, then perhaps it no longer needed to exist. The idea was absurd, yes, but the alternative, living under Deborah's constant threat, was even more so. He decided not to confront Deborah directly about the flyer. What would be the point? She would likely dismiss his concerns, claim it was a miscommunication, or simply reiterate her perceived authority. No, words were clearly not enough anymore. Actions, bold and irreversible, were needed. His first concrete step was to call a local demolition company. He found their number in an online search, his fingers hovering over the keypad for a long moment before pressing the call button. When a cheerful voice answered, Alex took a deep breath. "Yes, hello," he began, his voice surprisingly steady. "I'm calling about a residential demolition. I own a property at 123 Maple Street." He provided his address, and the representative on the other end, a man named Frank, explained the process. Frank was genial and professional, asking questions about the size of the house, access to the property, and the desired timeline. "Well, ideally," Alex said, his voice a little hoarse, "as soon as possible. Within the next few weeks, if permits can be expedited." Frank chuckled. "Expediting permits can be tricky, but we'll certainly do our best. We'll need to send someone out for an assessment, draw up a proposal, and then get the city's green light. Usually, from initial contact to demolition day, we're looking at about 6 to 8 weeks. Sometimes less, sometimes more, depending on the municipality. 6 to 8 weeks. That was cutting it close. The flyer indicated the spring gala was less than a month away, and the intimate garden reception portion of it, meaning the wedding, was presumably part of that event. He would need to push hard. Is there any way to speed that up? Alex pressed. I have a rather urgent timeline. Frank paused. Well, we can mark it as a priority. If you have all your property deeds, and there are no outstanding liens or complex environmental issues, that helps. We'd need to get on site right away to do a full walkthrough and start the paperwork. Alex agreed to an immediate assessment, scheduling Frank's team to visit the very next morning. He felt a strange mix of terror and exhilarating resolve. This was real. This was happening. That evening, he carefully packed away his most cherished possessions, old photo albums, his grandfather's antique watch, a collection of first-edition books, and a small, hand-carved wooden bird his niece had given him. He felt like he was preparing for an evacuation, systematically dismantling the emotional anchors of his home. Each item he carefully wrapped and placed in a box felt like a quiet act of rebellion, a small defiance against the impending invasion. He also packed up his important documents, his deed, his insurance papers, copies of all the HOA correspondence, including the problem residence letter and the spring gala flyer. The following morning, as promised, a team from the demolition company arrived. Frank, a burly man with a kind face, walked through the house with Alex, notepad in hand, making quiet observations. He measured rooms, inspected the foundation, and even climbed into the attic. Alex watched him, feeling a detached sense of unreality. This was his home, the place he had lovingly restored, and now it was being appraised for its destruction. As Frank was finishing up, taking notes on his clipboard in the driveway, Deborah appeared, seemingly out of nowhere. She was wearing a perfectly pressed tracksuit, as if she'd just returned from an invigorating morning power walk, though Alex had never seen her exercise. She stopped abruptly, her eyes narrowing as she took in the sight of Frank's company truck parked in front of Alex's house, its logo emblazoned with the words, Maplewood Demolition and Excavation. Her gaze then darted to Frank's clipboard, her curiosity clearly piqued. "Good morning, gentlemen," she chirped, her voice overly sweet, a clear signal that something was amiss in her world. She approached them, her smile fixed but her eyes darting nervously between Alex and Frank. "Alex, dear, what's all this commotion so early? Are you finally getting rid of that unsightly garden shed? You know it's not up to code." She tried to sound casual, but her tone betrayed her. Alex felt a flicker of grim satisfaction. He decided to play along, at least for a moment. "Morning, Deborah," he said, his voice even and calm. "No, not the shed. Frank here is just giving me an estimate." Deborah's eyes, bright with speculation, landed on Frank's clipboard. She tried to subtly angle her head for a better view, but Frank, sensing the tension, deliberately turned his back slightly, shielding his notes. "An estimate for what, precisely, Alex? Are you finally going to replace that old fence? The bylaws do stipulate a uniform fence height for the perimeter properties." Alex met her gaze, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. "Oh, it's nothing like that, Deborah. It's a bit more comprehensive. Frank is helping me with some major property adjustments." He let the words hang in the air, ambiguous and unsettling. Deborah's smile wavered. Her brow furrowed slightly. "Major adjustments? Alex, you know any significant exterior changes require prior HOA approval. And a permit from the Architectural Review Committee. You haven't submitted anything." Her voice was starting to lose its saccharine edge, a hint of her usual authoritarian tone creeping in. Frank, sensing Alex's unspoken signal, stepped forward. "Good morning, ma'am," he said politely. I'm Frank Miller from Maplewood Demolition. Just here for an assessment for Mr. Thompson. He offered her a business card. Deborah took the card, her eyes widening as she read the company name. Demolition, she sputtered, her voice rising in pitch. Demolition? Alex, what on earth are you talking about? You're not demolishing your house, are you? Her face went pale, a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror contorting her features. The implications of what she was hearing clearly began to sink in, hitting her with the force of a physical blow. The control she so meticulously wielded, the absolute certainty of her authority, seemed to crumble around her. The mere thought of a demolition, especially his demolition, was an act of insubordination so profound it clearly hadn't even entered her sphere of possibility. Alex simply smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't reach his eyes. Well, Deborah, he said, his voice soft but firm, leaving no room for misinterpretation. As you know, you've recently designated my property a problem residence, due to a pattern of non-compliance, and you've even publicly announced your intention to use my underutilized private property for community events, such as the upcoming spring gala and garden reception. Since I clearly can't control what happens on my own property under your guidance, I figured the most effective way to ensure my house is no longer underutilized for unauthorized purposes, or a problem, in your eyes, is to ensure it simply isn't there. He paused, letting his words sink in, watching the color drain from Deborah's face. Her clipboard seemed to slip slightly in her suddenly trembling hand. So, yes, Deborah, Alex continued, the quiet menace in his voice palpable. Mr. Miller is indeed here to discuss the demolition of my house. Starting, if I can push the permits through, as soon as possible. He made sure to emphasize, as soon as possible, a subtle hint at the approaching gala. Deborah's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She tried to speak, but no words came out. The perfectly coiffed hair, the tailored tracksuit, the authoritative clipboard, all seemed to wilt under the weight of this shocking declaration. Her carefully constructed world of rules and control was suddenly, irrevocably threatened by an act of ultimate defiance. Her face, usually so composed, now looked utterly bewildered, on the verge of collapsing into a panic. The power she thought she wielded was suddenly meaningless in the face of a homeowner willing to erase his own property to escape her grasp. She spun on her heel, her usual composed stride replaced by a hurried, almost stumbling retreat down the street, clutching her business card like a cursed artifact. She was clearly going to her own house, presumably to consult her precious bylaws, to see if there was a rule, any rule, against a homeowner demolishing their own home. Alex knew there wasn't. There couldn't be. This was his land, his choice, his final stand. He turned to Frank, the grim satisfaction giving way to a renewed sense of purpose. So, Frank, he said, what's the absolute fastest we can get this done? Deborah's frantic retreat down Maple Street was a small, satisfying victory for Alex, a momentary balm for the months of frustration she had inflicted. He watched her disappear into her own meticulously kept house, knowing the news of his plan would be spreading like wildfire through the HOA grapevine. The initial shock had been replaced by a quiet determination, a steel resolve that hardened with every passing moment. Frank, the demolition contractor, had simply raised an eyebrow at Deborah's dramatic exit, then turned back to Alex with a thoughtful expression. "Okay, Mr. Thompson," Frank said, tucking his clipboard under his arm. "That was an interesting interaction. But to answer your question about speed, we can absolutely expedite things. We have a crew freed up earlier than expected due to a postponement on another job. If we can get the city permits approved quickly, we could be looking at demolition day in as little as 2 to 3 weeks." Alex's heart leaped. 2 to 3 weeks. That was cutting it even closer to the spring gala Deborah had so casually announced, but it was doable. He felt a surge of adrenaline. "What do I need to do?" he asked, his voice eager. "We'll handle the bulk of the paperwork," Frank explained, pulling out a tablet. "The city permits, utility disconnections, environmental checks, that's on us. But you'll need to make sure the house is completely empty of personal belongings. Anything left inside on demo day is considered part of the demolition. We also need a signed waiver from you confirming you understand the scope of work and that you're solely responsible for any contents remaining." He scrolled through the tablet, showing Alex a few digital forms. "And then there's the deposit. We'll need 50% upfront to secure the crew and start the permit process immediately." Alex nodded, feeling a strange mix of excitement and trepidation. This was it. The point of no return. He quickly reviewed the digital contract, signed where indicated, and arranged for the deposit transfer right there on the spot. Frank confirmed the payment, and with a handshake and a promise to call as soon as the permits were secured, he left. The house felt different after Frank departed. It was still the same familiar space, filled with his furniture and the scent of the lavender he'd brought in from the garden, but it now hummed with a quiet tension, the unspoken knowledge of its impending fate. Alex spent the rest of the day meticulously going through every room, every drawer, every closet. He wasn't just packing, he was performing an act of detachment. Each item he boxed up felt like letting go, severing a tie to a place that had become more of a battleground than a home. He found old photos tucked away, forgotten souvenirs from past trips, even a dried flower pressed between the pages of a book. He carefully sorted them, keeping only the most meaningful, the things that truly represented him, not just the house. He made plans to move everything he intended to keep into a storage unit across town, a place far from Maplewood Estates. He deliberately kept his plans quiet. He didn't tell Martha, or Sarah and David. He didn't want to cause them any distress or involve them in his drastic retaliation. He knew Deborah would eventually discover his true intentions, but he wanted the revelation to come at his chosen moment, to have the maximum impact. He felt a strange sense of peace as he worked, a powerful feeling of regaining control. If his property couldn't be his sanctuary, then it would be nothing. Days blurred into a focused routine of packing, purging, and preparing. He called utility companies to schedule disconnections for the target date. He made arrangements for temporary housing for himself. He even researched local charities for donating furniture and appliances he wouldn't be keeping. This was more than just moving out, it was dismantling a life, purposefully and methodically. He ate simple meals, slept little, and his mind was constantly buzzing with the logistics of his plan. He remembered his principles of kindness and empathy, and felt a twinge of sadness that it had come to this. He didn't wish harm on Deborah, but he could no longer tolerate her harm to him and to the spirit of the community. This was his last, desperate act of self-preservation. Then came the call from Frank. "Alex, good news. The city permits came through faster than expected. We're good to go. We've tentatively scheduled demolition for 2.5 weeks from now. Does that work for you?" Alex felt a jolt of triumph. Perfect, Frank. Absolutely perfect. The date was now set. It was exactly 3 days before the announced spring gala and the intimate garden reception at his house. The timing couldn't have been more precise. He worked even harder in the following days, the deadline looming large. He filled boxes, taped them shut, and stacked them neatly in his garage. He rented a small moving truck and, with the help of a couple of friendly day laborers he hired, began transporting his possessions to the storage unit. He purposely did this during off-peak hours, early mornings or late evenings, to avoid drawing attention. He didn't want Deborah to catch wind of the extensive moving before it was too late. He meticulously emptied his house, room by room, until only the largest pieces of furniture remained, things he planned to donate or sell quickly in the last few days. The house began to echo, its spaces feeling vast and hollow. One evening, as he was loading the last of his smaller boxes into the moving truck, he saw Martha standing on her porch, watching him with a concerned expression. He paused, feeling a pang of guilt for keeping his plans from her. She was a kind soul, and he knew she would be upset by the news. He walked over to her fence. "Everything all right, Alex, dear?" Martha asked, her voice soft. "You've been moving a lot of boxes. Are you doing some spring cleaning?" Alex hesitated, then decided a partial truth was better than a complete lie. "Something like that, Martha. Just reorganizing. Getting ready for some big changes around here." He smiled reassuringly, trying to hide the gravity of his words. Martha nodded slowly, her eyes still clouded with worry. "Well, just remember, you have friends here, Alex. If you need anything at all." "I know, Martha. And I appreciate that more than you know." He promised himself he would explain everything to her after the demolition, once the dust had settled. He genuinely cared for her. The final days before the demolition were a blur of activity. He sold off the remaining large furniture pieces at a steep discount, eager to clear the house completely. He made sure all the final utility disconnections were scheduled for the day before. He even had a locksmith change the locks on the doors, not that it mattered, but it was a small, symbolic act of reclaiming his territory before it vanished. The house was now completely empty, stripped bare of everything that made it a home. Its silence was profound, almost deafening. It stood there, a hollow shell, waiting for its appointed end. On the eve of the demolition, Alex drove past his house one last time. The windows were dark, like vacant eyes. The garden he had lovingly tended was still vibrant, blooming with the petunias and lavender he had planted. The gnome, still tucked away in his storage unit, was safe. A single street lamp cast long, eerie shadows across the lawn. He saw a few cars parked down the street, people putting up decorations for what looked like preliminary preparations for the gala. He even thought he saw a figure, perhaps Deborah, peering suspiciously from behind a curtain in her own house. He felt no regret, only a grim satisfaction. This was his ultimate statement. He checked into a small motel a few towns over, far enough away to avoid the noise and the prying eyes, but close enough to return if absolutely necessary. He barely slept, the hours ticking by with agonizing slowness. He pictured Deborah's reaction, the moment she would realize the full extent of his quiet rebellion. The thought filled him with a potent mix of dread and vindication. The next morning, the sun rose, casting a golden glow over Maplewood Estates. Alex sat in his motel room, sipping lukewarm coffee, his phone clutched in his hand. He imagined the scene unfolding back at Maple Street. The large machinery rumbling down the quiet residential street, the heavy equipment tearing up the asphalt. The orange safety fences being erected, cordoning off his property. The small crowd of curious neighbors, drawn out by the unusual commotion. And then, he pictured Deborah. He knew she would have gone ballistic. The demolition was scheduled for first thing in the morning, meaning the crew would arrive early, well before the day's activities for the gala were in full swing. He pictured her in her bathrobe, perhaps, storming out of her house, clipboard in hand, ready to issue a cease and desist order, only to be confronted by the undeniable reality of an excavator biting into the very foundation of what was once Alex's home. He felt his phone vibrate. It was Frank. "Mr. Thompson, just wanted to let you know, we're on site. Starting the initial setup now. Everything's proceeding as planned." Alex took a deep, shaky breath. "Thank you, Frank. Keep me updated." He hung up, his heart pounding. The demolition had begun. This was the point of no return. He had gone through with it. He had chosen to level his own house rather than allow Deborah to continue trampling over his rights. He imagined the dust rising, the sounds of tearing wood and shattering glass, and then, the frantic knocking on Deborah's door. It would be Felicity, the bride, or Kevin, the groom, or perhaps a frantic wedding planner, arriving at his house only to find a construction site where their garden reception was supposed to be. The realization, dawning slowly, would be catastrophic. The wedding, planned for his house, was now impossible. And all because Deborah had pushed him too far. What would happen next? What would the community say? What would Deborah do now that her carefully laid plans, and her perceived authority, lay in ruins along with his house? The demolition was now in full swing, a symphony of destruction echoing through the normally tranquil streets of Maplewood Estates. Alex pictured the scene vividly in his mind, the roar of the excavator, the crunch of wood and plaster, the rising cloud of dust. He knew the news would have reached Deborah by now, and the thought brought a grim satisfaction. He imagined her frantic calls, her outrage, her desperate attempts to halt the inevitable. But it was too late. The permits were secured, the machines were in motion, and his house, once a source of comfort and then a battleground, was rapidly becoming a memory. He decided it was time to leave the motel and witness the final moments of his defiant act. He drove back to Maplewood, his heart a strange mix of sadness and exhilaration. As he approached his street, he saw it. A massive dust cloud billowed above the treetops, visible from blocks away. Cars were parked haphazardly along the street, their occupants standing on lawns, necks craned, staring at the spectacle. He parked a few streets away and walked, feeling like a ghost approaching his own funeral. The scene that greeted him was even more chaotic than he'd imagined. The entire front of his house was gone, reduced to a heap of splintered wood and twisted metal. The excavator, a monstrous yellow machine, gnawed at the remaining structure, its mechanical arm tearing through walls with ease. Orange safety fencing surrounded the property, but onlookers pressed against it, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. And then he saw her. Deborah. She was standing at the edge of the police tape, her face flushed crimson, her perfectly coiffed hair disheveled, a single strand clinging stubbornly to her forehead. Her ever-present clipboard was clutched in a white-knuckled grip, but it seemed utterly useless now, a symbol of her impotent authority. She was yelling, her voice a shrill shriek that barely carried over the roar of the machinery. She was screaming at Frank, the demolition foreman, who stood calmly, arms crossed, listening patiently before offering a shrug and gesturing towards a stack of official-looking permits taped to a nearby pole. Near Deborah, a young woman in a crumpled white dress stood beside a man in a slightly too tight tuxedo. Felicity and Kevin. The bride and groom. Felicity was weeping openly, mascara streaking her face, while Kevin stood beside her, his face a mask of utter bewilderment. A woman with a headset, presumably the wedding planner, was pacing frantically on the sidewalk, making increasingly desperate phone calls. The chaos was magnificent. Alex approached the scene slowly, trying to remain inconspicuous, but his presence was soon noted. Martha, standing a little distance away, spotted him first. Her eyes widened, and she rushed towards him, her face a mixture of concern and bewildered admiration. "Alex, dear. What on earth have you done?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Before Alex could answer, Deborah's eyes, red-rimmed and furious, locked onto him. Her screaming at Frank stopped abruptly, her gaze sharpening into a laser-like glare of pure, unadulterated rage. "Alex Thompson," she shrieked, her voice reaching an almost inhuman pitch, cutting through the demolition noise for a terrifying second. She stormed towards him, her hands balled into fists, looking as though she might physically assault him. You did this," she accused, pointing a trembling finger at the crumbling remains of his house. "You destroyed your own property. You ruined Felicity and Kevin's wedding. Do you have any idea the chaos you've caused? The disgrace you've brought upon Maplewood Estates?" Alex met her gaze, his expression calm, almost serene. The moment he had anticipated had arrived. "Deborah," he said, his voice quiet but firm, easily audible over the distant machinery. "I didn't destroy my property. You did. You made it impossible for me to live here, to have any control over my own home. You unilaterally decided to use my underutilized private property for a community event without my permission. This, he gestured to the demolition, is merely the logical conclusion of your actions. Felicity, the bride, suddenly sobbed louder. Our wedding. It's ruined. My dream wedding. Deborah rounded on Alex, her eyes blazing. This is a violation of community standards. You can't just demolish a house in the middle of a residential street without consequence. Actually, Deborah, Alex replied, a slight edge entering his voice, I can. I secured all the necessary permits from the city. Frank and his team are fully licensed and authorized. My property is no longer a problem residence because, quite simply, it's no longer a residence. And as for underutilized private property, for your gala, well, you'll find that a pile of rubble is rather difficult to host a garden reception on. He watched as Deborah's face contorted, her jaw dropping open. The realization of his precise, calculated timing, the absolute finality of his action, hit her with visible force. This wasn't a tantrum, it was a deliberate, legal, and utterly devastating counterstrike. Her carefully constructed authority, her entire framework of control, was literally being torn down, brick by brick, before her very eyes. A few neighbors, who had been listening in hushed tones, began to murmur amongst themselves. Some looked shocked, others looked grimly satisfied. Martha put a hand on Alex's arm, a mixture of shock and quiet pride on her face. Deborah, still struggling to comprehend the depth of Alex's defiance, tried a different tactic. But the property values. Do you know what this will do to the property values of Maplewood Estates? A vacant lot. A construction site. This is an outrage. Perhaps, Alex conceded, his voice losing its confrontational edge and settling into a tired resignation. But what about the value of peace of mind? The value of privacy? The value of truly owning your own home, free from constant threats and arbitrary rules? Those values, Deborah, were destroyed long before the demolition started. And they were destroyed by you. He turned away from her, the argument feeling pointless now. The house was coming down. The wedding was ruined. His point was made. He felt a profound weariness, the emotional toll of the past months crashing down on him. He had won, but the victory felt hollow, tinged with the loss of what his home could have been. The loud crash of a falling wall punctuated his thoughts, sending another cloud of dust into the air. The physical destruction was almost complete. But the real chaos, the fallout from this extreme act, was just beginning. He knew this wouldn't be the end of it, not with Deborah involved. What would her next move be? How would the HOA react to such an unprecedented event? The community, once quiet and predictable, was now irrevocably changed, and Alex knew he was at the center of the storm. The dust settled, literally and figuratively, over Maplewood Estates. What was once Alex's meticulously cared-for home was now a flat, empty lot, a raw patch of earth amidst manicured lawns. The excavator rumbled away, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the loudest demolition. Deborah, still spluttering near the police tape, seemed to deflate, her righteous fury replaced by a bewildered, almost deflated expression. Felicity and Kevin, the would-be newlyweds, were escorted away by a flustered wedding planner, their dream ceremony a casualty of an HOA war. Alex stood there, surveying the blank slate where his house once stood. He felt an unexpected wave of exhaustion, but also a strange sense of liberation. The fight was over, at least for him. He had paid a heavy price, but he had reclaimed his autonomy. He glanced at Martha, who gave him a small, sad smile, then at other neighbors, some shaking their heads, others exchanging quiet, knowing glances. The community was buzzing, a hive of whispered conversations and shocked exclamations. This was a day Maplewood Estates would not soon forget. He knew, however, that Deborah wouldn't simply accept defeat. Her silence was more unsettling than her screams. She was a planner, a schemer, and he was certain she would be devising her next move, even as the last of the debris was cleared from his lot. He just didn't know what form her retaliation would take. He had demolished his house, but Deborah still held the power of the HOA, a power she clearly enjoyed wielding. True to form, a few days later, a new notice arrived, delivered by hand by a nervous-looking HOA assistant who quickly scurried away. This one was different. It wasn't a fine. It was an official summons for an emergency HOA board meeting, specifically to address the unprecedented and highly detrimental actions of Mr. Alex Thompson. The date was set for 2 days later. Alex knew this was it. Deborah would attempt to use every rule, every bylaw, and every ounce of her remaining power to punish him, perhaps even to ruin him financially. He prepared meticulously. He gathered all his documents. His deed, the demolition permits, the problem residence letter, the gala flyer that had listed his house, and records of every fine and every communication with Deborah. He even called Ms. Reynolds, his lawyer, who agreed to be present, albeit virtually, for the meeting. The emergency HOA board meeting was held in the small, sterile community center. The room was packed, every chair taken, with many residents standing along the walls. The air crackled with anticipation. Deborah sat at the head of a long table, flanked by the other, usually quieter, board members, who seemed uncomfortable with the spotlight. Deborah, however, looked invigorated, her eyes sharp and determined, her usual crisp demeanor fully restored. She wore a severe black suit, as if presiding over a tribunal. "Neighbors," Deborah began, her voice resonating with forced gravitas, "we are here tonight to address a grave matter. As you all know, the actions of Mr. Alex Thompson have caused significant disruption and financial distress to our community. Not only did he unilaterally destroy his property, creating an unsightly blight in our beautiful neighborhood, but he also sabotaged a crucial community fundraising event, the Spring Gala, which was relying on his property for the garden reception portion." She paused, letting her words hang in the air, allowing a murmur of agreement to ripple through a few of the more loyal HOA members. Alex remained silent, letting her weave her narrative of victimhood and outrage. Deborah then launched into her attack. She presented a series of motions. First, a motion to levy an unprecedented, unsightly property fine of $500 per day until the lot was restored to a habitable state. Second, a motion to expel Alex from the HOA, which, she explained, would mean forfeiture of his land, as all properties in Maplewood Estates were strictly governed by HOA covenants. This was her ace in the hole, the ultimate power play. Finally, a motion to sue Alex for damages, including the lost revenue from the cancelled gala and emotional distress to the community. Her voice grew louder, more impassioned, as she detailed his alleged transgressions, painting him as a rogue agent, a destroyer of peace. When it was Alex's turn to speak, a hush fell over the room. He stood, calm and composed, Ms. Reynolds's voice whispering in his earpiece through a discreet Bluetooth device. "Thank you, Deborah," he began, his voice clear and steady. "Neighbors, I understand your concerns. However, I want to present the facts." He then systematically laid out his case. He detailed the months of harassment, the arbitrary rules, the escalating fines, and the constant surveillance. He showed the problem residence letter, highlighting the clause about underutilized private property. He projected the gala flyer onto a screen, pointing to the small asterisk and his name, clearly listed without his consent. He explained how Deborah's actions had rendered his home unlivable, forcing his hand. "My house," Alex stated, his voice ringing with conviction, "was not destroyed. It was liberated. It was freed from an oppressive regime that believed it had the right to dictate every aspect of my private life and property. I did not sabotage the gala, Deborah did. She assumed control over my private property, publicly advertised its use, and never once sought my permission. The consequence of her actions, not mine, is that the venue became unavailable. He then brought out his most powerful evidence. Furthermore, he continued, I have documented proof, notarized affidavits from other residents, detailing similar patterns of arbitrary enforcement, privacy invasions, and unreasonable demands from our HOA president. He projected scans of these affidavits, carefully redacted to protect his neighbors, but clear enough to show a pattern. Martha's complaint about her bird feeder, the miller's rose bush, Mr. Henderson's flag, all were there, a damning indictment of Deborah's reign. A murmur, this time of uneasy agreement, swept through the room. Faces turned from Deborah to Alex, then back again. Doubt was beginning to creep into the minds of many long-suffering residents. Deborah, however, was not about to yield. These are baseless accusations, she shrieked. Smears. He's trying to deflect from his own destructive behavior. Is he, Deborah? A voice from the back of the room called out. It was Mr. Henderson, the retired veteran, his voice shaky but firm. Because I have a copy of the fine you sent me for my flag. The flag I flew proudly for 50 years. Another voice, a woman, spoke up. And my fence. You made me replace a perfectly good fence because it was half an inch too tall, according to your personal ruler. The murmurs grew into an angry buzz. The dam had broken. Years of pent-up frustration from other residents, subjected to Deborah's petty tyranny, finally erupted. Residents began shouting out their own grievances, their own stories of arbitrary rules and unjust fines. The meeting descended into chaos, Deborah's authority visibly crumbling under the weight of collective outrage. In the midst of the escalating commotion, Alex played his final card. Neighbors, he announced, raising his voice above the din, I have something else to present. He projected a scanned document onto the screen, a rarely seen, obscure clause from the original Maplewood Estates founding documents, one that predated Deborah's tenure and her numerous addendums. This is Article 12, subsection D, of our original HOA charter, Alex explained, his voice resonating with newfound authority. It states, should any property owner demonstrate a clear and repeated pattern of behavior detrimental to the spirit of community harmony, through actions that consistently and demonstrably infringe upon the fundamental rights and peace of their neighbors, the residents of Maplewood Estates may, by a 2/3 majority vote, petition for a recall of any elected board member. This clause, neighbors, was designed to protect us from individuals who abuse their power. The room went silent. Every eye was on the screen, then on Deborah, then back to Alex. The implication was clear. He wasn't just defending himself, he was turning the tables. Deborah's face, which had been red with anger, now turned ashen. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, seeing the accusing faces of her neighbors, the very people she had tried to control. Her clipboard slipped from her grasp and clattered to the floor, forgotten. I have prepared a petition for a vote of no confidence and recall for the current HOA president, Alex stated, pulling out a stack of papers. Based on the evidence presented tonight, and the testimonies of many of you. If 2/3 of the property owners sign this petition, we can force a special election, remove Deborah from her position, and elect a board that truly represents the interests of this community. He placed the petition on the table, and within moments, Martha was the first to approach, her hand shaking slightly as she signed. Then Mr. Henderson, then Sarah and David, and then a steady stream of residents, their faces grim but determined. They had suffered in silence for too long. The ending was wild. The recall petition gained momentum with astonishing speed. Deborah, utterly defeated, stood frozen, watching her reign crumble. The emergency meeting ended not with fines or lawsuits against Alex, but with the undeniable prospect of Deborah's immediate removal from power. In the days that followed, the petition garnered overwhelming support. Deborah, seeing the writing on the wall, and facing potential legal action for her own abuses of power, as Ms. Reynolds had subtly hinted at during the meeting, quietly resigned from her position as HOA president, citing personal reasons. A new, interim board was quickly formed, comprised of reasonable, community-minded individuals, including Martha and Sarah, who pledged to review all existing bylaws and foster a spirit of genuine cooperation, not coercion. Alex's empty lot remained a stark reminder of the battle, but it was no longer a blight. It was a monument to resistance, a blank canvas symbolizing newfound freedom. He eventually sold the lot to a young couple who promised to build a beautiful, modern home, respecting the community but also valuing their privacy. Alex himself decided to move to a charming old farmhouse outside of town, a place with no HOA, where the only rules were his own, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the gentle chirping of birds. He learned a profound lesson. That sometimes, to preserve one's peace and stand up for fundamental rights, even the most drastic actions are necessary. His empty lot in Maplewood Estates became a silent legend, a story whispered among neighbors about the day a man chose to demolish his own house rather than surrender his peace to an HOA Karen. It was a wild, unexpected end, but one that finally brought true harmony to Maplewood Estates, albeit at a monumental cost.